All right, so without further ado, again, my name is Mary Clark. I'm with Community Data. I'm going to introduce our three guests today. We have David Crenna, we have Michelle German, and we have Melissa Kelly. So David Crenna has been a long-time fan of Community Data. He comes to us with much experience and is going to be a partner in our housing data project over the next little while. He's got a 50-year-long career in housing policy and related urban fields. He is currently the co-founder of Priority Decision Data, Inc. Many years ago, he has worked with CMHC as a researcher, a policy analyst, a policy director, and he was also the assistant to the president of corporate planning. He served as a social policy advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada for a few years. And most recently, he was also the director of the urban policy and research at the Canadian Home Builders Association, and that was from 1993 to 2019. David's education is in political science, political sociology, and urban geography, respectively. His latest degree from Western and his PhD. Thank you very much, David, for coming. David is going to be a big part of moving our research forward on housing data. So you will be seeing his name and you'll be seeing his face over the next little while, I believe, with all of our community data projects. So we look forward to hearing more and more from David. Michelle is currently the Vice President of Policy Strategy at WoodGreen Community Services. She's worked successfully with broad coalitions of people to advance ideas into action. Some of her projects include the Toronto Youth Food Policy Council, the GTA Housing Action Lab, the National Housing Collaborative, Move the GTHA, and Future Cities Canada. So thank you very much for joining us, Michelle. We're excited to hear more about the project you're currently working on, and I know that will come up. And we have Melissa Kelly in Calgary. She's the Affordable Housing Research Assistant, coming to us from 2 devices at a time to get things working. She has a background in sociology and a master's of research. And for the past 13 years, she's worked with the City of Calgary as a research and policy analyst. Most recently, she is the Affordable Housing Research Analyst at Calgary Housing. So these are 3 people that I invited because they are passionate and they're interested in talking about housing. These are people who are committed to moving housing data forward, particularly so we can actually make some headway and make some decisions and produce more affordable housing and make the housing situation better in Canada. So hopefully you will enjoy today's conversation. Okay, so here's their headshots. This is my backup plan in case we have to block out our video feed. But in the meantime, I'm going to just, sorry, give me a second while I do my technical switch over. I'm going to make our faces a little bigger because we learned earlier that that makes the feed a little better. Well, it's a little better. Hang on, it's not working the same as it just did. Which never does, of course, right? Sorry, folks, give me another second. Okay, I think that's what we want to do. Hopefully the video feed shortens out a little bit as we go. All right, by way of introduction and to get our conversation going, I thought I would ask each of our guests today to just share a story of a time that they were working with housing data and how it actually helped them make a decision in their professional lives. So I will start with David. We're going to hear lots from David today, and he's been working the longest. So let's start with David.
You hear me all right?
There you are. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Thanks, David. Yes, you're good.
Excellent. So like I hope most people working in the policy advice field, one always questions the policies you're recommending yourself. Maybe not saying they're awful, but just keeping a bit of an open mind about where they're heading and what they're achieving. So I worked on the development in the 1970s of the new generation of social housing programs, not-for-profit and cooperative programs that replaced, in effect, public housing. And I basically said at the time to myself, if this is our main tool, how fast is it actually going to deal with the need? When will we be able to say we were successful in addressing the full scope of the housing need, if ever? And it's still a relevant question today because we're spending something like $40 billion of money, depending on how you count it, on social housing developments of various kinds and housing subsidies of various kinds. Some of them are loans, some of them are soft loans, some of them are subsidies. So I always looked at the question of, if we were doing X number of units a year, how long would our plan be? Get everybody housed properly. So that basically the data I looked at is our annual production, social housing, in relation to the numbers in core need. Okay. And if you're doing 15,000 units a year, which is not far off what we're doing now, certainly not doing more than that, that turns out, if you're dealing with 1.3 million households in core need, be an 87-year plan. Okay, so real simple math, and I guess the conclusion I drew from that quite a long time ago now is we need a variety of instruments and policies to deal with the full scope of housing need, including, of course, rehabilitation programs, including what we now have starting a couple of years ago, a housing benefit across Canada. So that's my quickie thing about housing data. I hope it makes sense. And of course, if people want to challenge it, great.
David? Melissa, what about you? When was the time you used housing data to actually make a decision? Oh, hang on. Sorry, I muted you, Melissa, because I was getting feedback. Don't start yet. Okay, go ahead, Melissa.
Okay. Then you good. Okay. I was just saying that I would never dream of challenging David. So I won't go there. But my example is a little bit more practical. So when I started in my role with the affordable housing, I was super lucky that my predecessors, Claire Noble and Cheryl Sellinger, they had developed this amazing tool that's super practical, and we use it all the time. So they did a criteria analysis related to locating affordable housing and assessing the sort of ideal locations in the city to place affordable housing. And they did a big geospatial analysis and created a map where we can input an address and outputs a score, basically a suitability score. So this is based on a variety of amenities that are important when you're locating affordable housing, so school, transportation, libraries, employment centers, and they were all weighted based on some consultation that we did with internal and external stakeholders. And they also, we took into consideration, they constraints like there's a certain part of Calgary where you're not supposed to have housing because of the airport, because of the planes flying this direction, so you can't, the noise is an issue, although they're looking at changing that. Floodplains, major roads, because you don't want to build a place for families to live right beside like a freeway where kids might be running. As a mother of 5 and 7-year-olds, I'm happy we're not living on a major freeway. Mm-hmm. And so they also created 3 separate variations of this. So one is one specific to families and children, and one specific to people without children, because there's different things you need to take into consideration, schools and employment centers and things like that. So that it is an amazing tool, and we use it to help us make decisions all the time. So we use it to help us identify the best sites to sell to nonprofit. We have a program called the Nonprofit Land Sale, and the city sells land at below market value to nonprofits to build housing. So we'll use that to help identify the best sites for that. We use it when we're trying to find sites for us to build. Also, the city of Calgary does build some affordable housing ourselves. And what I kind of want to say related to that is it's really helpful and important tool, but it's only one of many other things that feed into that decision. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're talking about how you use data to make decisions. It's often not based on one sole data point, right? You're going to use that in cooperation with other things, like in this case, things like the site availability, what else is around it, what else, community characteristics, environmental contamination, a variety of things. So, and related to that, if you're going to use a tool like that, it's also important to keep it updated. So data is only good for as long as the data is good for, and right now we're due for an update on that. And I believe there's also a lot of other cities that are doing similar projects because it's such a useful tool. I listened to a webinar last year, and I think Peel was doing something relatively similar. So lots of us are kind of thinking along the same lines on that.
That's very cool. Thanks, Melissa. Michelle, you got a story for us?
Everyone, thanks for having me. Yeah, I've got a story. It's probably even smaller scale than both of those stories, but not in my last role, I was working on a project. It was part of the GTA Housing Action Lab, and it was a number of years ago in the GTHA when inclusionary zoning policies were being developed, and several municipalities were really asking themselves, how do we implement this? Like, what do incentives packages look like in order to get housing built? And so, our role as this third space to experiment with ideas around policy and support people in implementing them in great ways. We looked at the problem and said, okay, so what's the problem here? You don't have political support for the policies? And they said, no, we have political support. And I said, okay, so do you know the kinds of tools you're able to use? And they said, oh yeah, we know the kinds of tools we're able to use. So what's the problem? And I said, well, we don't really understand the data and the housing economics, the price of construction, the price of time that it takes to build something. We really need all of that data in specific neighborhoods where we'd like to target in order to understand what kinds of tools, policy tools, to use where and when. In an interesting way, we realized that the way to solve this problem was by doing a whole bunch of data collection. Not personally, but found the right partner to do that data collection on behalf of the municipalities so that they can then inform the policy tools and the legislative direction that they were going in. So we worked with 3 different municipal governments, different sizes, in order to identify the kind of data that they needed in order to develop or propose the kind of tools that they thought would be most effective. And then the end of the story is it was such an interesting process that our province worked with us to fund a fun tool online. It's called the Affordable Housing Calculator. And it's imperfect because, as Melissa said, data is only as good as it's updated.
Yeah.
But it's this tool where you can look at different kinds of markets all across Ontario, and using all of the data that we were able to collect from sources like Statistics Canada and other sources, they're escaping me, CMHC, etc. We were able to build this tool that actually visualizes what it takes, what kinds of incentives are required to build affordable housing in different jurisdictions. So that tool in and of itself allowed us to just get further in the conversation, because when I don't know how you're all feeling, but often when we're talking about inclusionary zoning and housing policy, people's eyes glaze over, but this allowed us to visualize data in a way that brought people onto the same page. So a city councilor could sit down with a residents association, could sit down with city staff, could sit down with a developer, and everyone can kind of understand what was needed by playing with this tool. So it was a really interesting way of using data, and it was very interesting when we stumbled on the fact that it's like, oh, it's a gap in data that we need to get further in the conversation.
That's cool. That's neat to be able to identify that gap, and to start with political support as opposed to be using the data to generate political support, because it is often sort of a mix, right? You know, we do have complex problems, and they're not always, you can't always follow this step-by-step process. And what Melissa was saying, even when you find a tool that works, it's still only one tool that needs to be involved in the decision making. So hopefully that will give you all a little bit more insight into our guests. One of the things that I wanted to follow through on was, do you now have a data set that you use very frequently that comes up in sort of your regular go-to work, that sort of as soon as it's updated, you're looking at it, or something you find yourself looking back at often? So I'm looking for your favorite source of housing data or favorite housing survey. Melissa, do you have one?
So I have so many. How do I even choose? Yeah, I based on my previous role as a general sort of research analyst, I'm so partial to the federal census. It holds such a dear place in my heart. I feel like it's of such high value because it's administered nationwide. It's a census. It counts so many people, and you can cross-tabulate it with so many other variables. So these days we're talking a lot about disaggregated data and race-based data, things like that. So there's a huge value in the census in that a lot of the housing variables can be cross-tabulated against different types of households, people that are immigrants, people that are indigenous. You can dig down into families with children, families with people with different levels of education. So I find that highly useful, and they have several variables that I'm very partial to. So there's the one indicator we use often for housing need is the shelter to income ratio. So I'm sure lots of people here are familiar with that, but the shelter STIR. So often it's if you are spending more than 30% of your income on housing, then you're considered you're considered to be overspending. So you can cross-tabulate on that one and see what type of family and people households are overspending on their shelter. They also have a question about subsidized housing. So if you are, and it's self-reported, so the reliability of it is what it is. But if someone considers themselves to be living in a subsidized housing, they'll mark that, and so you can get lots of figures for that. Or and there's also variables on core housing needs that come from there. So many choices. And I also really want to mention this new one that I'm very excited about is CMHC's Social and Affordable Housing Survey. So they have gone through one round of data collection on this and are currently doing their second. I believe they're funded to do 10 rounds of this as part of the National Housing Strategy. So I'm looking forward to digging deeper into that one as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. David, I know you probably have a long list of favorite housing surveys, but I'll ask you for your most favorite or the one you reference the most.
My
no.
sure has
David,
been
have we lost
frozen.
you? There you are.
I don't know if you can hear me, right?
Audio is fine.
Okay, perfect.
We can hear you. Go for it.
I look much the same from time to time. I'm just sorry we don't have Zoom in which you can put a funny hat on. In any case.
You have to actually get a real funny hat to put on.
From my previous days of tracking the what was happening in housing production, I guess my favorite site at sort of go-to place at that point was Housing Starts. And the second favorite go-to place was the demographic data that Stats can figure out what's going on with population growth, immigration, etc. All of the factors of growth in urban places. So I'm afraid on that, I'm a member of the Bad News Bears. Have you ever heard of that baseball team? I think it's a baseball team. Anyway, so I look for potential bad news. And one of the things that I recently found on a StatCan release was that in the last quarter of 2020, this will not be a shock to people, Canada grew by a grand total of 2,700 people, which is not, we have not seen that kind of slow growth since 1946, right after the war. So I just basically keep track of things that are changing in the overall housing environment, is my short answer. Basically, that's why I suggest that everybody who's concerned about the future of their city, also similarly from time to time, not obsessing, but look at those kinds of indicators as well.
And Housing Starts is an interesting one because it is more frequent than some of our other sources.
Well, the only other thing I'd say about that is ignore what the CMHC press release says, because it's based on a month-to-month change in the seasonally adjusted number. I always look at the year-to-year changes for the same month. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a much more important indicator to have. That's all.
No, that makes sense. Thanks, David. Michelle, I'm going to ask you the same question. What's your favorite, your go-to? And while we're hearing from Michelle, for all of our audience here today, feel free, if you have one that's your favorite, feel free to type it in the chat box. It'll be interesting to see if we get any repeats. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah. I think I might, I don't know how much more I can add. I mean, I usually go to Census and Statistics Canada data. It seems to be the cleanest and the most, I of course like to read how other people analyze things. Recently, I mean, I do follow, I like Urban Nation in Toronto. They often do interesting, crunches of housing prices. So I was just reading this week that the rental market has gone down 10% in the city of Toronto, and the vacancy rate has gone up to 5.7%, which is, I don't know, the highest it's been in probably decades. So I do look at, people who synthesize data interestingly and post about it, but generally, if it's a matter of making a decision. And then, at our organization, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, we are on a data journey to be able to have our own data sets that will help us make decisions and hopefully be my favorite data set moving forward.
Wouldn't that be great if your favorite data was the one that you actually had some input into and got to be part of that collection every year, and then you got to see how it was used all the time?
Yeah.
It'd be awesome.
One can dream, can't they?
Yeah, that's right. Well, and that's part of why we don't have slides today, right? We want to hear the dreams. We don't want to just hear what we can put on slides. One of the things that we experience, and I know all of our collective membership in the community data program, are huge data gaps. Now, we often see big data gaps in vulnerable populations. I know that we've had a few expressed, a few people put that in their questions. Thank you for everybody who put questions in when they registered. It really helps guide our conversation. And so some of the data gaps people really noted were things like housing data for rural areas or small towns, housing data for Black Canadians or other Indigenous groups, our secondary rental market, data on evictions, and also data at those on risk of losing housing. So I thought I'd bring that up, and feel free for our attendees to comment too if you want to just mention a gap in the data that you experience that you would really love to have filled. And for my panelists, I'm going to sort of make it a little bit more complex. And I'm going to ask you if you experience a data gap and if you've done some sort of workaround. So without getting too, we don't want to go down this line of being totally depressed about all the gaps we have that we don't have in the data. But I'd love to know if you experience a gap and you've come up with a workaround. Who wants to go? Michelle, have you had to do a workaround? Or Melissa, you've got one for me?
People have been.
Yeah. Oh. What just happened with the sound?
Sorry, I think we were paused and so everybody came back on at once. Okay, Michelle, what have you got for me?
Yeah, well, I would say very hyper-local. So for those of you who aren't familiar with my agency, we're a local multi-service agency. We've been around for about 84 years, and what that's meant is we've grown and changed over time based on the community's needs. So recently, we were undergoing a sort of a visioning process for the new strategic plan over the next 4 or 5 years, and we had a data gap in our own organization to look at who exactly are we serving and what is the status of their background, socioeconomic, race, age, gender, and all that. So I mean, I guess for us the workaround has been 2 parts. One, it has been just kind of going to our frontline staff and trying to, at least anecdotally, and this is a very local data problem, so it's a very local data solution where we just had to do a bit of an informal survey or a formal survey to say, what are your clients like? Tell us about your clients, and have a series of conversations and looking at our program plan. So really getting into the weeds and seeing it at this very micro scale in order to inform decisions that we were going to make. And then the entire experience has propelled us into creating a data strategy for our organization, acknowledging that in this day and age we need to be able to very specifically understand who we're serving and what the impact of things are. And while we do in different pockets, some programs are set up to know exactly how many people and all of that stuff, other ones aren't. So I would imagine that a lot of municipalities and agencies and community groups would have a similar kind of gap. And so we're hoping that the data journey that we're on can be shared and hopefully inform how other organizations figure it out as well, because I think everybody's going to have to take this big leap forward into understanding the particulars that hopefully ladder up to things like the census and Statistics Canada data that give you a very high-level overview of people. So, a couple workarounds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is got to be a lot of informal conversation happening between community groups and those on the front lines, right? And hearing that feedback and saying, who on an average day are you seeing? Who's coming into your office? And while we can't always capture that, we are people, right? And hopefully there's a lot of human relationships involved. And so trying to capture that information in a sort of fair and equitable way that allows for privacy but still informs programs and move things forward is very important. Melissa, what about you? Have you had a workaround for a gap in data that you've experienced? Muted you again. You get 2 tries at it when I mess up.
I get, yeah. Yeah, I think everyone, I think the solution to a lot of data gaps is everyone is just forced to create their own data to go out and get it themselves, which it's good because you get your local data, but it's problematic because you lose consistency. You don't have as much rigor as maybe some of the other more widely available data sources. You can't compare to other people. So where you get what's going to work for your needs, but you have to make some sacrifices. So we have a huge need in Calgary for kind of point level data for where the affordable housing buildings are. And so the social and affordable housing survey that CMHC does, it presents everything at an aggregated level, census census data, again, everything is aggregated, and it's just very difficult to get. It's possible, but it's very difficult to get the point level data from big surveys like that. So we have done every couple of years, 4 to 5 years, we do our own survey of the providers in Calgary to get that point level data. And so then we're able to do things like geospatial analysis on it. So that's how we filled that gap. And our other gap that I find is in a workable definition for affordable housing and affordable housing needs. I feel like every city sort of makes their own definition for that. There's the general 30% of STIR definition that's nationwide. There's the core housing definition that everyone sort of can use, but a lot of those measures aren't meaningful at the local level. Like for Calgary, the 30% of STIR is okay, but it may also include people that are higher income and are okay with spending more than 30% of their income on their housing. So, for example, our workaround on that is we ordered custom data from StatsCan to use a cutoff of people that are spending 30% of their or more of their income on housing, but they only make below 65% of our average median income. So that's how we've worked around to use a meaningful definition for affordable housing need in Calgary. So go forth and make your own data.
Michelle, do you have the similar problem? Do you guys have your own working definition of affordable housing?
I just keep muting and unmuting. Not at this level, but I know that many municipalities are looking at that. So we've engaged in the conversation with the City of Toronto. They're in the process of redefining what affordable housing means, and looking at average income versus average. So redefining the STIR that Melissa had talked about as well. So I mean, we kind of get stuck in what the policies say and the programs, but we can certainly weigh in to say that the cost of living has risen to ways where housing costs hasn't been met with income. So what we see in practice is certainly people spending way more than the cost, 30% on housing, and even when people are spending 30% on housing. We're seeing people struggle to make a living, to keep their kids in childcare, to feed their families, etc., to take care of their elderly parents. So I would say our working definition is, we're aligned with what the legislation said, but day to day we certainly see the impact of the cost of living in very real ways, and have tried to do good advocacy so that whatever the new definition evolves over time takes into account all of those things.
Absolutely. Is that something you would like to see worked on? I mean, it sounds like, Melissa, you would definitely advocate for having a more useful definition and then have everybody be using the same run, right? So that you can be comparing and generate a bit more numbers and information from each other.
That would be so exciting.
Definitely. And I don't know, Melissa, the 80% AMR is something that's hugely problematic, at least in our area, because, affordable housing at 80% average market rent is still completely out of reach for so much of the population.
Yes, totally agree. And some policies are for 80% AMR, some are median, so AMR average market rent, or there's median market rent sometimes we compare against, or it's 90%. It's all over the place.
That makes sense. David, do you want a chance to chime in on our conversation about gaps in data that you experience, or on the definition of affordable housing?
Sorry for the lack of, it's probably a relief not to have the picture, huh? Anyway,
okay, we still have your
still picture. A quick and really simple. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've gotten a lot grayer since. Anyway, one quick workaround for small centers, which is one of the questions people had, is that I've used is there are actually two counts of housing in the census. One is occupied units, the other is simply units. And if you look at the smaller places, so on, I've tried to find a way just to calculate production rates in different centers. Okay, so you just go to the highlights table in the census data, and it gives you the actual number of units that they've counted, which are, I think, about 300,000 or 400,000 higher, which makes sense, eh?
Oh.
And because of vacancies, people moving and so on. So you just divide that by 5, and you've got a rough cut of the annual production of new units, or the annual addition. That way, if that's important for you to say to council.
David,
hey,
your audio is fading in and out for me. Is it okay for everybody else?
Oh.
Is David fading in and out? Is it kind of... Okay.
I'm not sure what.
Okay, well, it's just finicky is what it is. David, can you just summarize your workaround?
The workaround is go to the census, get the actual number of units they counted in the census, and divide by 5. There you are with a potential annual addition to your stock.
Okay.
For small centers in which they don't give, which they don't give starts. I mean, these starts from CMHC or completions stop more or less at the larger census agglomerations, right? Mm-hmm. And then they estimate the rest.
Yeah, so for smaller areas, you can just take the 5-year total, divide by 5, and you can sort of make up a 5-year count at least.
Right.
Okay. We did have a number of people who were wondering about secondary suites. It's not actually a topic I was going to bring up, but it does play a really interesting role in the housing market. And not surprisingly, a lot of the questions came from our Vancouver area. So I thought while we had Michelle and Melissa with us, we talk a little bit about housing suites and the kind of the data that is there or is missing and their experience with data around secondary suites and its role in affordable housing. Melissa, do you want to start? Oh, hang on, I gotta unmute her. There we go. Go ahead, Melissa.
Okay. This is a really interesting question, and I'm glad someone asked it because as Mary was sending us some information about the talk today, I was like, oh, what does Calgary have for data on secondary suites? And lo and behold, the City of Calgary has a secondary suites registry, and it's actually online. There's a map with it and everything. So one thing I find about housing data is that it's all over the place, and you just can never keep on top of it. So we do have secondary suites data, but you have to dig into it a little bit or take it with a grain of salt to understand what's actually showing. So these are what we're showing on this map is going to be what's registered. So there's a huge difference between what we call legal and illegal suites. Illegal suites may be legal, but they're just haven't been gone through the official processes with the city. And what's showing on the map is everything that's ever been registered. So it's not necessarily everything that is being used at this point. There's stuff that maybe was used at one time and it was an older house, and now the older house is demolished and there's the new infill there. But the data is still showing that there was at some point a secondary suite there. So I think we could definitely get better information on that. And because it is such an important component of the sort of housing spectrum, it provides often a cheaper place for people to live, but it's also contributing because it's providing the income for the people that are renting that out. So I guess it would also fall into the conversation about data gaps.
Michelle, what about you? How much are secondary suites playing into your conversation of your data plan going forward? I don't know if everybody heard that Michelle's big plan right now is that they're actually looking to add a lot of units. And so this is a big area for her right now.
Yeah, I mean, I actually would punt this to David. I think for us, secondary suites at this point doesn't play much of a role. But I do know that, I mean, something I've observed around secondary suites is just the opportunity of alternative housing options. And so to Melissa's point, I think there's a barrier to understanding kind of what the potential as well as what's actually out there in terms of alternative housing. I mean, maybe it's not really alternative housing, but it's not single family housing because there's laws and zoning and building permits that people are kind of offside, so they're either not going to get into the system or they're not going to register in the system, like Melissa was saying. But I know David was looking at specific data across the country around secondary suites, so maybe he wants to weigh in here. And for me, it's more just an interest rather than being directly engaged.
Okay.
But do you want me to talk about that?
We want you to talk about it, David. Let us know what you think. What have you got for us on secondary suites?
Okay, so as you probably know, the census was essentially the height of buildings in the census was set sometime probably in 1900. So the tallest buildings you can find there are everything above 5 stories. So in 2014, I went to CMHC and said, surely we can get out of the universe of thinking that all of the new construction is under 5 stories, because I've walked down Yonge Street and there's a 70-story building called Aura on Yonge Street. The other side of that, though, is that they started collecting the heights of buildings. And lo and behold, they also collected accessory suites that were newly constructed. So I'm the proud possessor of an unpublished data set on accessory suites and buildings across Canada that are newly built by height. And I've just been trying to get them into everybody's hands. So anybody who wants it, please let us know and we'll arrange for CDP to put up the data, because we have it from 2014 to 2019 and we'll get 2020 very soon. And it includes the accessory suites basically show that in Alberta they changed the rules, right? They changed the law under the previous government, and so they became more welcoming, and so you can actually see by province and by locality what the change in new production of accessories was and is. Unfortunately, it only goes down to the CMA and CA level, but it's still better than nothing in terms of new production.
Mary, are you on mute?
I also mute myself.
Yeah, you're on mute, Mary.
Every time someone says, "Are you on mute?" you have to take a drink of coffee.
Yeah, and then I'll be buzzed by the end of this.
Yeah.
David, there are already a few people who are interested. There's some exclamation points going up, so that's something that we will have to get out to people. Yeah.
Hot damn. Perfect. That's really great. I'm really interested in getting that out.
This actually makes me think about, we do have some of these really neat and interesting local data sets. So Melissa shared one, David has shared another one. For our guests and then also for our audience, I'm wondering, is there a local data set? So I'm not talking CMHC, I'm not talking StatsCan, but something that is created at a local level, a local data set that you know about, that you're a little bit envious about, and that you would really like to have produced in your own geography. Like if you could just have that done, that survey done for your neighborhood, for your community, you'd just be thrilled. Is there one out there that you would love to see replicated for your own area? Michelle?
I'm going to go because you haven't muted me yet.
Perfect. Go ahead, Melissa.
But I don't have much to say because I think it's a question of knowing about them. Like there's so much out there, and so you kind of get familiar with everything that's widely available, and then you're digging into your own stuff. But I'm sure there's something someone else has done that we would be interested in, but I can't. Nothing that I know off the top of my head right now.
Well, and part of why
I'm always jealous of the private sector.
Sorry, go ahead, Michelle. Yeah, there's something in the private sector.
Oh, yeah, I'm just always jealous of the private sector. I mean, if you go to an organization like Google or Apple or Amazon, any big tech, they know everything about their employees and their customers, and they have trends and dashboards. So, I mean, I don't know what that looks like, but from, the public sector's point of view and nonprofit sector's point of view, I think that there are systems out there of collecting data that tell you, how people behave. I don't want to get too creepy, but how people behave and how they interact with your services and where they live and what they do. And I mean, that would be great to have. So I often read, I'm part of this digest. I think it's called The Hustle, but it gives sort of a tech breakdown of news. And there's so much information that we have the technical capacity to gather that I see mostly in the private sector, that I think the public sector, given a magic wand and a blank check, would really be able to make better decisions and implement. So that's my crush on a data set.
Yeah, I mean, imagine being able to use all that data about habits and use it for a social good instead of to sell more products to people or how to get them products faster, whatever they're trying to do. Does any of our audience have a local data set that you use? It can be one of your own as well, one that you produce that you use. One of the things that we will be looking at over the next little while in this housing project Community Data is taking on is some of the local data sets and just looking at them to understand how they're valuable and what can be reproduced and what we can learn from them. And I think Melissa made a good point that we don't always have time to be looking at other communities and figuring out what they even have that would be useful for us, right? Because most of us don't have 10 or 15 hours a week for creative thinking around data and looking at stuff. Your to-do lists are quite long. So that's one of the things we will be talking and asking more people about over the next little while. The other thing I was thinking we could talk about is the data we use to measure outcomes. Some of our members are real data geeks, and I love that when we get into our heavy data conversations, and it's really fun to see what the data can tell us and what we can learn. But one of the things we want to do right now, particularly with this national housing strategy, is look at how do we get the data and move it all the way through to outcomes and make those decisions so that we're actually producing more housing or there's more housing available. And so I'm wondering about looking at housing data and using it to measure outcomes for policies and programs that you are involved with. So can you tell me a little bit about using data and how it's important for measuring those outcomes? David, we haven't heard from you in a few minutes. Do you want to share? Oh, there you are. Yes.
Can you hear me all right?
Hi, David.
Hello?
Yes, you're good.
Yes? Great. Okay. So the reality is that there is a very strong bias toward looking for production as the key measure of something happening. Okay? So whenever you read the various annual reports of provincial governments and the federal government, it talks about adding more units of this and that. And in some cases, even in terms of rehabilitation, for example, you don't even have the numbers of units affected. The Natural Resources Canada actually has some of the best outcomes data for housing because they focus on whether the housing is consuming more energy or less. So to me, that would be a measure of an outcome rather than in a saying how many units were renovated, insulation put in. It would be saying we actually consumed less energy in housing than we did 10 years ago. No, that's bad news in Alberta, maybe, but I'm just saying that's one of the environmental outcomes that we're looking to measure. So it's been very difficult to get good measures of outcomes in housing, and it may be an impossible task. But the key thing is to keep pressing and keep improving, pressing onward for the data about how to get better outcomes, and to focus our collection on that in terms of quality of life and so on. At least some of that is being collected now in the Canadian Housing Survey. In other words, they're asking people, are you more satisfied than you used to be about the unit you're in, et cetera, et cetera. So that to me, again, is an outcome. It may be soft. Does that help on outcomes? We're still doing not too good on it, bottom line, because it's so much easier just to talk about numbers of units added.
I think it is important to know the number of units added. It is nice to have some clear measures that we can track and, a little bit more clear. But I think having those outcomes that are a little bit more sort of into the gray area and saying, are you happier housing? Is it more suitable to what you're doing? Are we producing things that people actually want to live in? They're important outcomes as we spend money, and especially as we look at different populations and different ways households operate. Michelle or Melissa? Go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, I think Melissa was saying unmute her, but you can unmute her. While,
no, I think she's pointing at you. I'm pointing. What am I doing? I'm pointing down. She's pointing at you.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the question is the role, sorry, I'm just looking at it.
The role of housing data and outcomes.
Outcomes, and yeah. I mean, I would say when you're talking about metrics and thinking about what change over time looks like, half of it's probably data and the other half are other ways to measure outcomes. So I think if we're talking about like the National Housing Strategy, for example, they have this big audacious goal to make sure everyone living in Canada has a place to live that they feel safe and suitable. So what does that mean? That means that there's a number of units. That means that people, like you said, Mary, are happy where they are. They feel safe, it's suitable, it's close to where they work. And I think the only way to measure that is to understand how big the problem is. So I bet David would understand this and let us know, do we even understand the problem from a data perspective? And then what are benchmarks to get us there? So I think that there's a huge role, and we can make all the announcements we want and say how many units we've been able to start or build, but without truly understanding, what are the outcomes? The outcomes are safe, suitable housing. So things like how many people live in a house with how many bedrooms. I think CMHC's definition of suitable is that there's enough bedrooms for enough people. So understanding across Canada, do we have what percentage of people live in unsuitable housing? I think that would be a really important thing to measure. I think how much it costs is important, but also, building on the conversation we were having earlier, it's not just housing costs, it's also childcare costs, it's also transportation costs. So maybe it's, how do we bring together a more holistic view of affordable housing so that we're understanding, what people have and what they're trying to do? Because, as a single person without kids, 30% of my income on housing is no problem. But if I had 3 that were all in daycare, that would be an entirely different scenario. So I think taking a more holistic view and bringing together data sets, probably through the lens of social determinants of health, when we're talking about affordable housing, would be beneficial. So in that sense, I would say, what are partnerships that we can strike between public health agencies and Statistics Canada and CMHC after we figure out what it is that we're measuring. I don't know, Melissa, you want to?
I'm gonna get a sore neck here from nodding to all the amazing points that you guys are making.
Start using the thumbs up. This is my kids, their current stuff when they agree with their teachers, the thumbs up so they can see them. So instead of the head nodding, it's...
I just did something.
Then the pointing.
Oh, I put little hands. I think there's a clapping hands beside my name, and now I think applause. Yeah, really, really good points from both David and Michelle. One, outcomes are not outputs. So output, okay, we've built this many housing, this many units, even dollars per unit is more of an output than an outcome. And then thinking about social determinants of health, there's a new, I don't know if it's new, but a way of talking about housing now. It's a component of health, so it's like healthy housing. And I just have so many notes here because I was like, yes. Locally, there's been work on different affordable housing providers may do their own satisfaction surveys, like how satisfied are you with living here? Has it given you more disposable income to address your different financial needs? On a small scale, that's helpful, but on the bigger picture, it's super important. What was I going to say? And the Canadian Housing Survey that David mentioned, it's asking people about, are they happy experiences in housing? And then we have all these other surveys that measure if you're in affordable housing and stuff, but they're always separate. There's data sources on structures, there's this much affordable housing, it's this old, this is what the rent is, and then there's data sets like the social affordable, or the Canadian Housing Survey. I think that's one. That's asking how people feel. But it's the bringing them together. So I know there are people that are thinking about this. One of CMHC is doing all these different calls, funding opportunities, and there's a social housing supply challenge going on right now too. And I know there's some people in that area that are looking at this more broadly, how can we even predict housing outcomes? If we plug in all these sort of factors, are we going to expect good outcomes? And is it housing outcomes? So people are living in housing that's affordable and suitable and in good repair? Or is it even bigger than just housing outcomes, that they're able to go to school, able to meet their childcare needs, they're socially included in their neighborhood. So much work that we can do in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to start thinking about that stuff, because how do you design housing surveys if you don't know what your outcomes and what you want to measure in the long run? I mean, you don't know what your answer is going to be. But if you don't know how you're even going to use the data at the end to know how you're progressing and if you're getting where you want to go, it's really difficult. And so, Melissa, I really like that idea of matching them up so that you make sure you have your outcomes are not just housing, but what is the housing allowing, right? What is the housing facilitating? Do people feel safer? Are people included? Are they getting access to jobs? Are they getting access to services that they need? Or are they isolating? Are they, creating more problems within their homes? But yeah, we need the data needs to design for that at the beginning as well. David, you want to share something? Chime in.
Say that one of the sort of just responding to Craig Jones' comment and some others, that two things. One is that I think we can certainly use more fully the building permits data to dig into deeper into what's actually happening in the housing stock, and that may lead to some outcomes measures as well. The other thing we need to do as a start is to relate two different indicators to each other and see how they're trending. So I give you, for example, are we building enough housing to accommodate the population growth we're getting? I mean, that basic indicator has been done by a grand total recently of one organization, the Parliamentary Budget Office, believe it or not. Okay, so the question is, obviously, if we're getting more and more crowded or more into worse and worse condition housing, there is a distribution and there is a not matching the demographic demand potential issue. I'm not saying we're there, but I guess what I'm saying is you only get it out of putting one indicator in the context of another indicator, two together.
David, I think you had some thoughts on us too about. Sorry, are you still going?
Well, I was just going to say in terms of Craig that indeed the whole question of excluding new development is very much an issue in the States, and it is also an issue, a quieter issue here in Canada, but the reality is indeed we have massive areas of cities that are zoned what they call yellow zones, where you can simply not get in with something new, so that's creating, in effect, issues for people down the road. Just a little known fact: all of the major metropolitan areas, I can send you the chart, are losing population to other centers in the province.
I think that's happening in the United States too. That's a wider trend.
You were going to ask something?
Melissa or Michelle, did you want to comment back to David?
Okay, I'm just checking my mic status. Yeah, I put an asterisk here on my paper with building permits. I meant to go back to that too. I think it is a big potential source of information that we're currently underusing. Often, like at the City of Calgary, we're completely sort of different departments. So that's part of the reason we have to break down that silo a little bit better. But it's right, like live, like kind of on the ground data about what's happening now. So yeah, I think we should do more with that for sure.
I just noticed, I don't have a lot to add here, but I just noticed in the chat, it seems like quite a number of people, Aaron from Langley says we rely on building permits a lot. Halifax, Emily said Halifax building permit data and building details are on their data page. So I guess these would be a great answer to the question you asked us earlier, what are workarounds, and how are we plugging into, if we can't see sort of what the outcomes are, how are we tracking different kinds of things? And maybe it's an interesting thing to consider when we're thinking about metrics and change over time, because yes, there's a million data gaps and there's a lot of partnerships and kind of cross tabulations we have to do, but what are data sets that exist that we can kind of maybe look at from a different perspective? So building permits is probably a good example of that, of telling us something in real time of what's getting built and where, and then of course adding in those gaps of for whom and did it work and all that other stuff. So, interesting.
And maybe there's an opportunity of influencing that at the start too. So working with the people collecting the building permits data, like maybe they can ask one more question or something like that when they're getting those permits in, like add one field to their form. That could help you further down the line when you're doing your outcome or outputs or whatever type of measurement.
Yeah, that's a neat idea to explore. I'm waiting on the tick, tick, tick from the comments, you know, the little bubbles that are coming up. Feel free, anybody, if you do have comments or any questions. We do have our guests here for about 20 more minutes. We're going to wrap up soon, but if you do have a question for us, let me know. I have a couple I'm going to keep moving us along that I want to hear about. One of the things that I wanted to chat a little bit about was looking at projections. I know this is something I hear often from people, is that, you know, we'd love to know what we're looking at as far as, you know, population projections, what do we think can get built in the next little while, and how that can help us a lot with our planning. And David, I think you had some thoughts and some ideas on the data we have for housing projections, looking at growth and demand and need for housing.
Two things. One is that I'd like to say that it would be really good as a projection of desire to have people fill out their survey if they have not done so already. It would be really great to hear from you on this and other issues. The second point is that projections, and I've written a whole book on this. Projections are very political because they say implicitly, like we have 1,500 localities across Canada that are losing population in net terms. So projections are happy making for some politicians and not happy making for others. So I just put that out there as a context, but the crucial point is that we do need to have projections of both what's feasible, like Craig I think is talking about, what's feasible to happen within the footprint of cities right now and the nearby areas. That's a very important question, and it's in all of the municipal plans. And secondly, there's population projection and changes, and COVID, among other things, has put right on the table the whole question of projections for how we're going to care for an increasing number of elderly people. One of the fastest growing population cohorts in the country is those 85 and over. Okay, so at a minimum, we should be having projections on those who are going to need different housing than they had and that are going to move out of the standard house because they can't shovel the snow anymore or whatever. So I guess what I would say is I think we get around the issue of saying a projection is a total vision of the future to saying a projection is needed for those who are going to have changing needs. Okay, let's imagine in effect what those are, pick those ones out, and identify the plans we need to deal with, especially for the elderly, those with disabilities, people of color, etc., in terms of the growth that we can anticipate and how we will.
I can weigh in if I'm unmuted. So the question about data and projections, I think that we get fixated on, these single, we'll have this many people, so we need X, Y, and Z. I think a better approach would be using strategic foresight or using scenario planning. In fact, I know, Melissa, I don't know if it is connected to any of the work you do, but I know the City of Calgary, through the Smart Cities Initiative, was establishing some foresight work into how they were doing some urban planning. And I know other municipalities are looking at that as well. But I think it offers a much more three-dimensional concept of what the future might hold, right? So if we have this much population and these are the other conditions in which, we're anticipating, X amount of people who are newcomers to Canada, X amount of seniors, X amount of children, new families. It really allows us to think differently about the kind of housing we need. I've been to a couple of the home builders dinners over the years, and I think the government and the building industry, and it just seems like everyone gets so fixated on numbers. We have this many people, we need this many houses. But, we already have the infrastructure for suburbs built all across the country. So the question I would ask is what kind of housing in what is the right location and for whom? And something that I've been on my soapbox a lot about is really building and developing things for the end user. So to David's point, it can get quite political when you're looking for infrastructure dollars and you're focused on, industry support. But I think if you change the perception and get more into who you're building for or who you're trying to produce things for, because it's not always building, it could be like the housing benefit where it just helps people stay where they are, and then get away from just straight projections and more into what's the scenario going to be, and potentially what are some different scenarios that we should be planning around and considering. I think it positions us better to actually produce results that can build better communities.
What do you think, Melissa?
That's awesome. I agree, and I agree. Yes, I don't know how people project the future. That's completely not my area. It blows my mind how people can think in that way. I'm like, what's the numbers right now? Tell me. More of a concrete kind of person. But I think those are good points about thinking about different ways of making these projections, of thinking about the needs of future people in our cities or in our country. And projecting by needs, I think, is a great point. Like I did actually in a while ago now was on a housing and the aging population project, and it is a huge thing we need to be thinking about. And there was a group in the city that had done some kind of forecasting specific to that population, and we were talking about the different types of housing they would need for that. But you sort of do get, you can have the best projections, and you could know, if for some reason you did know, I know we need to serve this many seniors, I know we need to serve these many immigrants, I know there'll be this many people in constrained financial circumstances. Even if you knew all that information, it's the then what, like how do you then create the housing that meets those projections? Because you can only influence and incent to a certain degree.
Absolutely. Sorry, let me read our comments. I'm going to catch up here a little bit. Erin in Langley was saying that they do a housing needs report every 5 years that they're required to do for BC municipalities. So that must be going to the province. Yeah, so the overall projection, it's a 5-year projection that Erin is saying that they need to produce. So Erin, yeah. Feel free to share a few more details about that. That's quite interesting. Yeah, I think there is interesting ideas here, and having projections that are a little bit more tailored and tell a bigger story about what's happening in our communities, right? Where we have to be more in touch with not just the numbers, but about who those people are and what they're going through, and what we expect their next 5 years or their next phase of life to look like, and then what housing is the most suitable for that, and whether that's staying where they are or moving, or that's new people coming into our cities. And what they look like, and understanding that better can certainly paint a better picture for us, and drive our policies and programs, and hopefully end up with better units in the end, right? That are more reasonable for everybody. We've only got a few more minutes, and I did want to ask all of you, right now, I mean, you are all, this is your day job, but I also know that you all have a passion for this. So why do you feel like right now, why is now a good time to be working on this issue? And why is right now a good time to be improving our housing data? David, you go ahead and start.
Well, I've said it somewhat extent already. This is partly just that the money is available to do some things that will last in the housing data field. Quite a lot of money, maybe like $40 million going out in various ways through the Housing Supply Challenge and others. So it's a good opportunity simply to have the resources to do things that we didn't have the resources for in the past. And the second thing, I guess, is as we look into the future in terms of climate change, the pandemic, and a variety of other unavoidable issues, housing is going to be part of all of them. And more decision makers are going to be looking for how they can set sensible priorities with evidence in terms.
Thanks, David. Melissa, what do you think?
I think it's like the alignment of the stars right now, I think, for housing and housing data. The National Housing Strategy has really made it a priority at the federal level with the funding, and also with the new data. Like, there's funding for more data, but they've also released a whole bunch of new data sets between StatsCan and CMHC. I have like a list of things to dig into. Some of them we've talked about. There's also StatsCan has a proximity measures database, which is like where you can see how housing is related or measure things against other things. So transit stops, schools, grocery stores. I think they have a national database of that. Index of multiple deprivation. There's a social inclusion index supposed to be coming out from CMHC. Historical data of income and spatial mobility project. There's like so much happening right now. And then data-wise, politically, there's so much happening. And then COVID has actually really shone the light on housing and the importance of it. It's an essential component of health. There's the Rapid Housing Initiative. The federal government is giving out money to cities and nonprofits, organizations to build housing fast because they know this is really going to impact COVID and get people into better housing circumstances. And COVID has also like changed the market. So there's an opportunity to kind of the housing market. It's going to spend some time rebalancing, right? So there may be an opportunity in terms of affordable housing of getting into the market, so to speak. And there's going to be greater need for housing because of COVID. So people are having different financial and employment circumstances. And the other sort of area that makes it a really good time is just technologically. It seems like now's the time where a lot of the data visualization tools are really becoming more accessible. Power BI, Tableau. So it's giving more people opportunities to play with the information, and there's more advances in linking data between different data sets. So I think this is the time to be doing this work.
Which is good news for those of us doing this work right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Michelle?
I mean, I agree with everything David and everything Melissa said. So I'll just add things like additional reasons why it's a good time. There's more pressure than ever to have outcomes and to be able to measure them. So we have the National Housing Strategy, we have the technology, and we have a lot of stars aligning. But if we're not able to show progress at a national level, we're not able to show progress at a provincial and municipal level, and even at a community level for us, we won't be able to continue to do this work. You know, the political tides will change. There will be other issues that people start to galvanize around. But I think all of us who know housing know that this is going to persist, and it's been persisting for decades and decades. So in order, I think, to continue this work, we need to more and more be able to show the impact. And I think the way we do that is through data, because it allows us to occupy a space that's a little bit less political. You know, whoever is in charge day to day is, you know, might respond similarly to what gets done and how investments are advanced. So being able to tell that story in a powerful way, being able to tell the impact. One example that I always think of is the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Probably 6 or 7 years ago, used data and information to show the different costs of, you know, working with a client who ends up in jail, working with someone who ends up in hospital, chronically, someone who ends up in shelter, and then the cost of housing them. And I mean, surprise, the cheapest option was to just provide somebody with a house. And that, you know, is quite politically saleable, no matter who you are and what you're trying to achieve. So I think the reason now is that there's a lot of moving parts. People are moving quickly to make a difference in this realm. But if we're not capturing that story in a very specific way and able to demonstrate impact, then I think the future of the work would be threatened.
And I will just have one final comment for sort of question around that idea of why is now a good time. Do you feel like the network of people that you work with your colleagues, do you feel like there's room for creativity? Do you feel like there's room for change and pushing through? And do you feel like there's this real drive for saying we want change, we want it to be accountable, and so that we know we're actually achieving what we set out to achieve? Michelle?
I'm like,
I mean, I think so. Yeah. I think that's the spirit I feel in colleagues and a lot of focus. So yeah, optimistically, yes.
Good. Melissa?
I was like, my boss is on the call. Hi, Elsa.
Yeah. Yes, we're super excited over here. Yeah.
I think there is so much interest and so much priority on this. It's always resources. City of Calgary has just gone through a major budget cutting exercise too. So there's so much stuff that we want to do and we can do. It's just getting it done.
Yeah, but you find that there's still a feeling of being really limited resource-wise.
Yes, there's huge interest in doing it, and we're prioritizing, like getting done the most important things that we can do. But the list
the
under
key
that
issue is we can't do everything,
David,
at the depth everybody would like.
Final thought.
So certainly what I'm focusing on is an optimistic point of view that people are very interested in improving housing data. But we also need a discipline around which things are we really going to improve first and in the most depth. My own view, it's a personal view, is we start with life and death issues. So COVID is a life and death issue. Lack of safety and security in the home are life and death issues. So those help to focus the mind. Probably heard. They said the prospect of being hanged in the morning concentrates the mind wonderfully. So I mean, so that's the negative side, if you will. But the positive side is indeed it's really great to see so many people participating in this webinar, and I hope you stay tuned in terms of we can keep you interested over the whole course of the project.
Absolutely. Melissa, did you have another comment?
Just really quickly to build on this ideas, and like I think we need to leverage each other. So maybe the City of Calgary has done this suitability score, this mapping project, but other cities have done the same thing. So there's opportunity here with what CDP is doing also to maybe make sure people are not replicating and duplicating, and we can kind of work together.